The rain had been falling since early morning, turning the city streets gray and cold. People rushed past one another with umbrellas raised high, trying to escape the weather as quickly as possible. Near the center of downtown stood the old Grand Melrose Theater, a place known for hosting some of the most respected music events in the city. Large golden letters outside the building announced the piano audition that had attracted talented musicians from all over the region. Inside the theater lobby, the atmosphere was completely different from the quiet, rainy streets outside. Young performers filled the room with nervous excitement. Some wore expensive black suits while others carried polished instrument cases and thick folders of music sheets. Groups of contestants practiced difficult piano pieces on their phones or whispered confidently about famous music schools they had attended. Near the back of the waiting area, the glass doors slowly opened. A woman stepped inside quietly, carefully shaking rainwater from her old coat before closing the umbrella in her hands. She looked around uncertainly for a moment, as if wondering whether she truly belonged there. She was not dressed like the others. Her clothes were plain and simple. Her shoes looked worn from years of use, and the sleeves of her sweater were slightly faded. A thin leather folder rested tightly against her chest, protected carefully from the rain outside. A few strands of gray hair had escaped from her loose bun, but she made no attempt to fix them. Several people in the room glanced toward her before quickly looking away again. The woman walked slowly to the registration table near the entrance. The young assistant sitting there barely looked up. "Name?" he asked while flipping through papers. She cleared her throat softly. "Miss Elira." The assistant paused for a second after hearing her quiet voice. Then he searched through the contestant list before nodding. "Audition number 47, he said. "Please wait until your number is called." She thanked him politely and moved toward an empty chair in the far corner of the room. As she sat down, whispers quietly began spreading nearby. "Is she here for the audition? She looks lost. Maybe she's someone's mother." A few contestants laughed under their breath. Elira kept her eyes lowered. She acted as though she could not hear them, though every word reached her clearly. Across the room, a tall young pianist wearing an expensive dark jacket stared openly at her old folder and smiled arrogantly toward his friend. "She probably came to play beginner songs," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. His friend chuckled. "Maybe they're giving sympathy prizes now." Several people nearby laughed quietly. Elira tightened her fingers around the folder but remained silent. The truth was, she had almost turned around and gone home 3 different times that morning. Even while standing outside the theater doors in the rain, she had questioned whether coming there had been foolish. It had been nearly 26 years since she last performed in front of anyone. 26 years since she had sat before a real audience. 26 years since she allowed herself to believe music could still matter in her life. Now, sitting in that crowded room filled with talented young musicians, she suddenly felt older than ever. At the far side of the waiting hall stood a practice piano where contestants occasionally warmed up before their auditions. One by one, skilled performers sat there playing fast and complicated pieces that impressed everyone nearby. People gathered around them, clapping after difficult passages and complimenting one another confidently. Elira never moved from her chair. Instead, she quietly opened her old folder and looked down at the handwritten pages inside. The paper edges had become soft with age. Some corners were bent from years of use. Tiny pencil marks filled the margins beside the notes. It was not music copied from famous composers. She had written every note herself. Her fingers gently touched the pages as memories returned to her mind. Years ago, music had been the center of her entire world. When she was young, people often stopped outside her family's small home just to listen to her practice piano through the open windows. Her first music teacher once told her she played with rare emotion, the kind that could not simply be taught. For a while, it seemed certain she would become a professional pianist. But life had moved differently. Her father became sick when she was still very young. Hospital bills grew larger every month, and soon her family struggled to survive. Music lessons became impossible to afford. Instead of attending concerts and competitions, Elira spent her teenage years working long hours to help support her household. Later, when her father passed away, responsibilities only increased. Dreams slowly disappeared beneath everyday survival. Years passed. She married a gentleman who always encouraged her to play again. But even then life remained difficult. They worked hard simply to pay rent and raise their little son. There was never enough money for a piano of their own. Still, sometimes late at night, her husband would take her hand while passing music stores and say softly, "One day, you'll play again. I know you will." She had believed him. Until the accident. Everything changed after that. Her husband never returned home from work one winter evening, and suddenly Elira found herself alone, raising their child while trying to survive financially. Music became something distant and painful, something she buried deep inside herself because life no longer allowed space for dreams. Yet even after all those years, she never completely stopped playing. There was a small community center near her apartment with an old upright piano sitting forgotten in a dusty corner. Most people ignored it because several keys were slightly damaged and the sound was imperfect. But to Elira it was precious. After finishing work every evening, she quietly visited the center and practiced when nobody else was around. Sometimes she stayed until midnight, letting the music carry away the loneliness she never spoke about. Only one person ever truly listened. An elderly janitor who cleaned the building at night often paused outside the room while she played. Over time, he realized the quiet woman practicing alone possessed remarkable talent. One evening, months earlier, he had placed a newspaper advertisement on top of the piano before leaving work. City piano auditions, open to public applicants. At first, Elira laughed sadly after reading it. People like her did not belong in places like that anymore. But the janitor continued encouraging her every night. "You still have something special," he told her once. "You shouldn't hide it forever." Those words stayed in her heart for weeks. And somehow, after years of silence and fear, they eventually brought her here. Back in the waiting room, another contestant finished practicing near the piano and received loud applause from nearby listeners. The young man in the expensive jacket noticed Elira sitting alone again and smirked. "Aren't you going to practice?" he asked loudly. Several others looked over curiously. Elira gave a small polite smile. "I'll wait." "You sure?" he replied jokingly. "Stage fright can be dangerous." A few people laughed again. This time even the registration assistant smiled slightly. Elira lowered her eyes once more, pretending not to notice the embarrassment burning inside her chest. She wanted badly to leave. Her hands already felt cold with nerves. What if they were right? What if she truly no longer belonged there? What if years of private practice meant nothing compared to trained professionals? She stared toward the exit doors. For one dangerous moment, she nearly stood up. Then her fingers brushed against the folded photograph tucked carefully inside her music folder. It was an old picture of her husband holding their little son many years ago. On the back of the photograph, faded handwriting still remained. "Don't stop playing." Elira closed her eyes quietly. A long breath escaped her lips. Then she placed the photograph back into the folder and sat straighter in her chair. One by one, audition numbers continued being called through the theater speakers. Contestants disappeared behind the large stage doors before returning minutes later, either smiling proudly or looking disappointed. The waiting room slowly grew quieter as the day continued. Finally, nearly 3 hours after arriving, the speaker crackled once again. "Contestant 47, please prepare backstage." Elira froze. Her heartbeat immediately quickened. The room turned toward her as she slowly stood from her chair. For the first time, several contestants seemed genuinely surprised that she was actually participating. The young man in the dark jacket exchanged amused looks with his friends. "Well," he muttered softly, "this should be interesting." Elira ignored him. Holding her old music folder tightly against her chest, she began walking toward the backstage hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer she came to the stage doors, the louder her heartbeat became. From somewhere beyond the curtains, faint piano music echoed through the theater. Then the current performer finished. A short round of applause followed. One of the staff members approached Alira kindly and gestured toward the entrance curtain. "You're next." Her hands trembled slightly. For a second, fear wrapped itself around her again like a heavy weight. But then she remembered all the lonely nights spent practicing in silence. All the years she had hidden her love for music from the world. All the pain she had carried quietly for so long. This was not only an audition anymore. It was the first time in decades that she had allowed herself to be seen. The stage manager nodded gently toward her. "It's time." Alira swallowed nervously, took one slow breath, and stepped toward the bright stage lights waiting beyond the curtain. The bright stage lights felt almost blinding as Alira stepped through the curtain and onto the massive theater stage. For a brief moment, she could not hear anything except the sound of her own heartbeat. Rows of audience seats stretched before her in the dim light. At the center sat the judging panel behind a long table covered with papers and small lamps. Some judges looked tired after watching auditions all day. Others barely glanced up as she walked toward the piano. The grand piano stood alone beneath the spotlight. Elegant, powerful, intimidating. Alira slowed her steps as memories rushed through her mind. It had been many years since she had touched an instrument like this. The old piano at the community center was worn and damaged, but this one looked flawless. She could already feel nervousness returning to her chest. One of the judges adjusted his glasses while looking down at her registration form. "Alira," he said calmly, "you may begin whenever you're ready." She nodded softly but did not sit immediately. Instead, she stood quietly beside the piano for several seconds, trying to steady her breathing. Somewhere deep inside, fear whispered that she should walk away before embarrassing herself. From behind the stage curtains, faint laughter could still be heard from some contestants waiting backstage. Alira slowly sat down at the piano bench. Her fingers rested lightly above the keys but did not move yet. The theater became very still. One judge exchanged uncertain looks with another. A younger assistant near the front checked his watch impatiently. Then Alira closed her eyes. And suddenly, another memory returned so clearly that it almost felt real again. She was 16 years old, sitting beside her father near the small piano inside their old family home. Rain tapped gently against the windows while he listened proudly as she practiced late into the evening. "You play with your heart," he had once told her quietly. "Never lose that." At the time, she believed music would always remain part of her future. But life had changed too quickly after his illness. Her family's small savings disappeared within months because of medical bills. Alira left school to work in a clothing factory during the day while helping care for her younger siblings at night. The piano slowly gathered dust in the corner of their home because there was no longer time for practice. Sometimes she woke before sunrise just to play for a few minutes before work. Those short moments became the only peaceful part of her day. Even then, neighbors often gathered outside the windows to listen. One elderly woman from nearby once told her mother, "That girl was born with music in her soul." But talent alone could not solve the problems waiting inside their home. Eventually, her father passed away quietly one winter morning. After that, everything became even harder. Alira still remembered watching workers carry the old family piano out of the house because they needed money desperately. She had stood silently at the doorway while tears rolled down her face, feeling as though a part of herself was leaving forever. Years later, when she met the man who would become her husband, music slowly returned to her life in small ways again. He worked long hours repairing machines at a local garage, but no matter how tired he became, he always encouraged her to keep dreaming. Sometimes they walked past expensive music stores downtown after dinner, stopping to admire the pianos displayed behind the glass windows. One evening he smiled and said, "One day, I'll buy you one." Alira laughed softly at the impossible idea. "We can barely pay rent," she replied. "Still," he answered warmly, "dreams are free." That sentence stayed with her for years. Even during difficult times, he somehow found ways to keep hope alive inside their tiny apartment. On her birthdays, he often surprised her with simple gifts connected to music, old sheet music from second-hand stores, recordings of famous concerts, or small notebooks where she could write melodies. After their son was born, life became busier than ever, but they remained happy in the simple way many struggling families do. They did not own much, yet laughter still filled their home. Until the night everything shattered. The phone call came late during a freezing winter evening. There had been an accident on the highway. At first, Alira could barely understand the words being spoken to her. She remembered dropping the phone onto the kitchen floor while her little son slept in the next room. Nothing felt real after that. The days following the funeral passed like a blur of silence, unpaid bills, and overwhelming loneliness. Suddenly, she carried every responsibility alone. Rent, food, school expenses, work, everything depended on her now. Music disappeared completely from her life during those years. Not because she stopped loving it, but because survival demanded all her strength. She worked wherever she could, cleaning offices, folding clothes at stores, washing dishes in restaurants late into the night. Some days she returned home so exhausted she could barely stand. Still, she never complained. Her son needed her. That alone kept her moving forward. Years passed quietly. Her child grew older. Wrinkles slowly appeared around her eyes. Dreams became smaller and simpler with time. But sometimes, during sleepless nights, she still imagined herself sitting at a piano again, even if only for a few minutes. One evening after work, she discovered the old community center near her apartment building. Children attended classes there during the day, while elderly people gathered for activities in the evenings. In the corner of a small dusty room stood an upright piano with chipped paint and damaged keys. Most people ignored it, but Alira could not stop staring at it. The center manager noticed her interest and casually said, "Nobody uses it anymore. You can play if you want." At first, she hesitated. Her hands felt stiff after so many years away from serious practice. But eventually she sat down. The very first note nearly made her cry. Something buried deep inside her heart suddenly woke up again. From that day forward, she returned whenever possible. Some nights she practiced only 20 minutes before closing time. Other nights she stayed for hours after everyone left. Slowly, her fingers regained confidence. The music that had slept quietly inside her for decades began returning piece by piece. The elderly janitor often cleaned nearby while listening silently. One night, after hearing her play, he finally spoke. "You should never have stopped." Alira smiled sadly. "Life stopped it for me." The janitor shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "Life delayed it." Those words touched her deeply. Over the next several years, the community center became her second home. She practiced there through heartbreak, exhaustion, loneliness, and doubt. Music slowly became her way of healing wounds she never discussed with anyone. She even began composing her own pieces late at night. The melodies carried memories from every stage of her life. Childhood dreams, grief, struggle, love, fear, hope. The music became her personal story without words. Back in the theater, sitting before the grand piano now, all those years felt suddenly connected. Every painful memory, every sacrifice, every lonely night practicing alone, they had all led her to this moment. Alira slowly opened her eyes. Her trembling fingers touched the keys gently. The first soft note echoed through the theater. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. The sound carried something warm and deeply emotional that caught the judges off guard. Conversations backstage faded. Even the restless assistant near the front looked up from his papers. Alira continued playing quietly. The melody moved slowly at first, almost like someone remembering an old forgotten memory. Then the music gradually grew stronger, fuller, more powerful. Each note felt honest, real, human. The audience sitting in the shadows became completely silent. One judge leaned forward slightly, surprised by the emotional depth of the performance. Another stopped writing notes entirely. Behind the stage curtains, contestants who had mocked her earlier slowly gathered to listen. The young man in the expensive jacket frowned in confusion. This was not beginner music. Not even close. Alira's hands moved gracefully across the piano keys now with growing confidence. Years of hidden practice revealed themselves through every movement. Though her style was not flashy or arrogant, it carried extraordinary feeling. And somehow, that feeling reached everyone listening. The music no longer sounded like notes being played. It sounded like a life being remembered. Pain, love, loss, survival, hope. Everything flowed together through the piano. One woman sitting near the back of the theater quietly wiped tears from her eyes without fully understanding why. The elderly judge who had seemed bored earlier slowly removed his glasses, staring at Alira with complete attention now. For the first time that entire day, nobody in the theater was thinking about appearances, age, or expensive training. Only the music mattered. And at the center of it sat the quiet woman everyone had underestimated. The melody continued flowing through the theater like a quiet storm that nobody had expected. Every note carried warmth and emotion so deep that people seemed unable to look away from the stage. Alira no longer noticed the audience. The fear that had nearly stopped her from walking on stage slowly disappeared with every passing second. Her hands moved naturally now, almost as if they had been waiting years for this exact moment. The grand piano responded beautifully beneath her fingers. Soft notes rose gently before building into stronger waves of sound that filled every corner of the theater. The performance did not feel rehearsed or cold like some of the earlier auditions. It felt personal, alive. The judges sat completely still. One of them slowly lowered his pen onto the table, no longer pretending to take notes. Another leaned closer with both hands folded tightly together, watching Alira with growing disbelief. Backstage, more contestants gathered near the curtain entrance. The same young man who had mocked her earlier now stared silently toward the stage. His confident smile had completely disappeared. "How is she doing that?" one contestant whispered quietly. Nobody answered. Alira's music carried something impossible to fake. Technical skill alone could not explain it. Every note sounded connected to real memories and real emotions, and somehow everyone listening could feel it. As she played, images continued appearing in her mind like pieces of an old film. She remembered her son as a little boy sleeping on a chair at the community center while she practiced late at night nearby. She remembered coming home exhausted after long work shifts, yet still forcing herself to stay awake just to play for 30 minutes before bed. She remembered winter evenings when the heating inside the center barely worked, causing her fingers to ache from cold while she practiced alone. Still, she kept returning. Night after night, year after year. There had been moments when she nearly gave up completely. Sometimes loneliness became so heavy that even music could not fully comfort her. But somehow, sitting before that old upright piano always helped her breathe again. The janitor often brought her tea during late evenings while pretending not to interrupt her practice. "You know," he once said while handing her a warm cup, "most people stop chasing dreams because they think time has defeated them." Alira smiled sadly at the memory. "What if time really has defeated me?" she had asked quietly. The old man simply shrugged. "Then why does your music still sound alive?" That question stayed in her heart for months. Back in the theater, Alira's performance grew stronger. The soft opening melody transformed into something far more powerful now. Her fingers moved confidently across the piano with surprising speed and control. The audience could feel years of hidden dedication inside every passage. Several people exchanged stunned looks. The woman they had quietly judged for her plain appearance was delivering one of the most emotional performances of the entire audition. Even the stage staff standing near the walls had stopped working to listen. Near the back row of seats sat an older woman who attended nearly every music event held at the theater. She had watched hundreds of talented pianists over the years. But something about Alira's performance affected her deeply. "She's telling her whole life through that piano," the woman whispered softly to herself. And she was right. Without speaking a single word, Alira's music revealed everything she had carried inside for decades. The loneliness after losing her husband, the exhaustion of raising a child alone, the sadness of abandoned dreams, the quiet hope she never fully allowed to die. All of it lived inside the music. As the melody shifted again, one younger judge looked toward the head judge with genuine surprise. "This composition," he whispered carefully. Did she write it herself? The head judge nodded slowly while studying the paper before him. It says original work. The younger judge looked back toward the stage, clearly stunned, because this was not ordinary music. The composition sounded deeply professional, yet it carried emotional honesty rarely heard even among trained performers. Alira's hands trembled slightly during one difficult section, but she continued without hesitation. Instead of perfection, her performance carried humanity. And somehow that made it even more beautiful. People listening no longer cared about flawless technique. They cared about what they were feeling, and what they felt was real. The music suddenly softened again into a quieter melody filled with sadness. A silence settled over the theater so complete that even breathing seemed louder than usual. Somewhere backstage, a contestant quietly wiped tears from her face. The young man in the expensive jacket crossed his arms awkwardly, almost ashamed now of the jokes he had made earlier. She practiced alone all these years? Someone whispered beside him. He said nothing. On stage, Alira barely noticed the reaction around her. Her entire focus remained on the piano. The final section of the piece approached slowly, and with it came another memory she had not expected to feel so strongly. Her husband standing beside a music store window years ago, smiling warmly as he listened to her describe the kind of piano she dreamed of owning one day. "You talk about music like it's part of you," he once told her. "It is," she answered softly. At the time, neither of them realized how true that sentence would become. Even after grief, even after hardship, even after decades of silence, music had remained part of her. Now, for the first time in years, she no longer felt invisible while playing. The theater lights, the audience, the judges, none of it mattered anymore. Only the music mattered. And perhaps for the first time since losing her husband, Alira finally allowed herself to fully feel everything she had buried for so long. The final movement of the piece rose powerfully through the theater. The sound became rich, emotional, almost overwhelming. Several audience members stared at the stage with tears in their eyes. One judge slowly shook his head in disbelief while listening. Another leaned back in his chair as if trying to process what he was hearing. This was supposed to be an ordinary public audition. Yet somehow it had become something unforgettable. Alira's fingers moved with incredible emotion now, carrying the melody toward its ending. Then suddenly the music softened once more. Gentle notes floated quietly through the air like fading memories. The entire theater seemed frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody even looked away from the stage. And then came the final note. It echoed softly across the theater before disappearing into complete silence. Alira slowly lowered her hands from the keys. Her breathing felt uneven. For a brief second, she wondered if she had imagined the entire performance. The theater remained completely still. No applause. No voices. Nothing. The silence stretched painfully long. Alira's heart tightened with fear. Had they hated it? She lowered her eyes slightly, preparing herself for disappointment. Then suddenly, one sound broke through the silence. Clapping. Slow at first. The elderly head judge had risen from his chair. His eyes looked emotional as he continued applauding firmly. A second judge stood beside him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted into loud applause. People rose to their feet across the audience rows. The sound became overwhelming. Some contestants backstage even joined the standing ovation despite their earlier mockery. Alira looked up in complete shock. For a moment, she seemed unable to understand what was happening. The applause only grew louder. Several audience members cheered openly now. One woman near the front wiped tears from her face while clapping. The young man in the dark jacket stared toward Alira with embarrassment written clearly across his face. Earlier that day, he had laughed at her appearance without knowing anything about the person sitting quietly in the corner. Now he could barely look toward the stage. Alira slowly stood from the piano bench, overwhelmed and emotional. Her hands trembled again, but this time for a different reason. The head judge stepped closer to the front of the stage. "What was the name of that composition?" he asked gently once the applause softened slightly. Alira hesitated before answering. It doesn't really have one, she admitted quietly. The judge looked surprised. You wrote that yourself? She nodded softly. A murmur spread through the theater. The younger judges exchanged stunned glances again. How long ago did you compose it? Another judge asked. Alira thought for a moment. Over many years, she answered honestly. I kept adding pieces of my life into it. The room fell quiet again after hearing those words, because suddenly, everyone understood why the music felt so deeply emotional. It was not simply performance. It was memory, pain, love, survival. The head judge looked at her carefully before speaking again. Miss Alira, he said warmly, where exactly have you been hiding all these years? A small sad smile appeared on her face. Working, she replied softly. The honesty of that answer touched the room even more deeply. For the first time in decades, Alira no longer felt like an ordinary invisible woman sitting quietly in the corner of life. People were finally seeing her. Not because of expensive clothes, not because of fame, but because of the truth living inside her music. And somewhere backstage, the contestants who once mocked her stood silently realizing they had completely misunderstood the quiet woman they judged within seconds of meeting her. The applause inside the theater continued long after Alira stepped away from the piano bench. People were still standing, clapping with genuine emotion on their faces. Some audience members even looked at one another in disbelief, as though they had just witnessed something unexpected and deeply personal. Alira remained frozen beside the piano for several seconds. She had imagined many possible endings before walking onto the stage that day, but none of them looked like this. Not once had she imagined a standing ovation. The bright stage lights suddenly felt warmer now instead of frightening. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd, and for the first time since entering the theater that morning, she no longer saw judgment on people's faces. She saw respect. The head judge finally raised his hand gently, signaling for the applause to calm down. Thank you, everyone, he said softly into the microphone before turning toward Alira again. Please stay for a moment. Alira nodded nervously. One of the younger judges leaned closer to his microphone. I have to ask, he said honestly. Why have we never heard your name before? A small, uncomfortable smile crossed Alira's face. There wasn't really time for music, she answered quietly. The judge looked confused. But you clearly have years of training. I did, she replied softly. A very long time ago. The room remained silent while she spoke. Another judge carefully adjusted the papers in front of him. You mentioned you wrote that composition yourself. Have you performed it publicly before today? Alira shook her head. No. The judges exchanged surprised looks again. One audience member near the front whispered, that was the first time? Even backstage, contestants stared at one another in disbelief. The head judge folded his hands together thoughtfully. That piece carried extraordinary emotion, he said. Most musicians spend years trying to create that kind of connection with an audience. Alira lowered her eyes modestly. I wasn't trying to impress anyone, she admitted quietly. I just played what I lived. Those simple words touched the room even more deeply than the performance itself. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then suddenly the audience began applauding again. Softer this time, but filled with admiration. Alira felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had spent so many years feeling invisible that this moment almost felt unreal. The head judge smiled kindly before speaking once more. Thank you, Miss Alira. That was unforgettable. She nodded gratefully and slowly stepped away from the piano. As she walked toward the backstage curtains, the applause continued following her across the stage. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, several contestants moved aside silently to let her pass. Earlier that day, those same people had laughed at her clothes, her age, and her quiet behavior. Now nobody seemed to know what to say. A young woman who had previously whispered jokes with her friends stepped forward awkwardly. She hesitated before continuing. I just wanted to say your performance was beautiful. Alira smiled gently. Thank you. Another contestant shook his head in amazement. I honestly thought you were nervous because you didn't know how to play. Alira gave a small tired laugh. I was nervous, she admitted. Very nervous. That answer surprised them, because during the performance, she had seemed completely connected to the piano. The young man in the expensive jacket remained standing quietly near the hallway wall. His earlier confidence had disappeared completely. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to speak. Finally, he stepped closer. I owe you an apology, he said awkwardly without meeting her eyes. What I said earlier, it was disrespectful. Alira studied him for a second before answering softly. It's all right. No, he replied quickly. It's not. His voice carried genuine embarrassment now. I judged you before even hearing you play. Alira's expression softened kindly. A lot of people do that, she said gently. Sometimes we all forget there's a full life behind every face we see. The young man looked down quietly after hearing those words. For the first time that day, he truly understood how unfairly he had treated her. Nearby contestants listened silently, clearly affected by the conversation. Alira slowly walked farther down the backstage hallway toward the waiting area, still overwhelmed by everything happening around her. Her hands continued trembling slightly. Not from fear anymore, from emotion. She sat down alone in a small empty corner backstage and carefully placed her old music folder on her lap. For several moments she simply stared at it silently. The same worn folder that people had mocked only hours earlier now suddenly felt heavier somehow. Not physically, emotionally, carried her entire life inside those pages. The theater assistant who had registered contestants earlier approached carefully. His attitude had completely changed. Miss Alira, he said politely, the judges would like to speak with you again before you leave. She looked surprised. Now? Yes. He smiled nervously. Actually, everyone is talking about your performance. Alira followed him back toward a smaller conference room near the stage offices. Inside, the judges sat around a large wooden table discussing papers and notes. When she entered, several immediately looked up. The head judge stood warmly to greet her. Please sit. Alira sat quietly, unsure what to expect. One judge leaned forward with curiosity. Can I ask where you currently perform? Alira hesitated before answering honestly. At a community center near my apartment. The room fell silent again. You mean professionally? Another judge asked. She shook her head softly. No, just alone. The judges looked genuinely stunned. The younger judge frowned slightly. You practice on a community center piano? Yes. What kind of piano? Alira smiled faintly. An old one with damaged keys. Nobody spoke for several seconds after hearing that. The head judge slowly leaned back in his chair, clearly amazed. That somehow makes today even more extraordinary, he admitted quietly. Another judge looked through her application again. You listed no formal performances for over 2 decades. That's correct. And you've supported yourself through regular jobs all this time? Alira nodded. The room became deeply quiet once more. Not because they pitied her, but because they suddenly understood the strength hidden behind her calm appearance. Most performers on that stage had spent years surrounded by professional teachers, expensive instruments, and competitive music programs. Alira had built her talent alone in silence while surviving real hardships most people in the room could barely imagine. The younger judge finally smiled. I think everyone in that theater learned something important today. Alira looked at him uncertainly. What do you mean? He folded his hands carefully. Talent doesn't always arrive wearing confidence and expensive clothes. A small emotional smile appeared on her face. Before she could respond, a staff member entered the room holding a phone. Sorry to interrupt, he said quickly, but someone uploaded a clip of the performance online. The judges looked surprised. Already? The staff member nodded. People are sharing it very fast. He turned the phone screen toward them. Even in the short backstage recording, the emotional atmosphere inside the theater was obvious. The comments appearing beneath the video increased every second. Who is this woman? That performance gave me chills. This is more emotional than anything I've heard in years. The judges exchanged stunned looks again. Alira herself seemed uncomfortable seeing the attention. "I didn't come here to become famous," she said quietly. The head judge smiled kindly. "That's probably exactly why people connected with your music." Meanwhile, outside the conference room, conversations about her performance continued spreading throughout the theater. Contestants who had once ignored her were now discussing her composition with admiration. Audience members waited near the exits hoping to see her again before leaving. Even theater employees kept replaying short clips from phones backstage. One older cleaning worker smiled while watching the video. "She reminded people what music is supposed to feel like," he said quietly. Back inside the room, the judges finally informed Alira that she had officially advanced to the next stage of selections for the orchestra's special public concert. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood them. "I did?" she asked softly. The head judge nodded warmly. Without question, emotion immediately filled her eyes. For years, she had buried the idea that her music still mattered. Now strangers were telling her it mattered deeply. She looked down at her hands quietly. These same hands had folded clothes in stores, cleaned office floors, carried grocery bags home through snow and rain, and practiced silently on broken piano keys late at night. And somehow, after all those years, they had finally brought her back to music again. As Alira prepared to leave the theater later that evening, the rain outside had finally stopped. The city streets glistened beneath the lights while people slowly disappeared into the night around her. She stepped outside holding her old folder carefully against her chest. For the first time in many years, the heaviness she carried inside her heart felt slightly lighter. Her phone suddenly vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from her son. How did it go? Alira stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. "I think your father would have been proud tonight." A few moments later, another message appeared. He already would have been proud long before tonight. Tears quietly filled her eyes as she stood beneath the glowing theater lights. Because after decades of silence, struggle, and feeling forgotten by the world, something inside her life had finally changed. And deep down, even though she could not fully explain it yet, Alira knew this was only the beginning. By the next morning, Alira's life no longer felt quiet and invisible. The short video from her audition had spread across social media overnight. Thousands of people were sharing clips of her performance along with emotional comments about her story. Some called her inspiring. Others described her music as unforgettable. Alira herself did not even realize how widely the video had spread until she arrived at work the next morning. She had taken an early cleaning shift at a small office building downtown, just like she had done for years. To her, it was still a normal day. She wore the same simple clothes, carried the same old bag, and quietly pushed her cleaning cart through empty hallways before sunrise. But things felt different almost immediately. One younger employee inside the building stared at her strangely before finally asking, "Wait, were you the woman from that piano video?" Alira froze in surprise. "What video?" The employee quickly pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. There she was, sitting at the grand piano beneath the bright theater lights while emotional music played in the background. The video already had millions of views. Alira looked stunned. Comments continued appearing every second beneath the clip. "I cried listening to this. This woman deserves the world. Proof that talent has no age. Her music feels real." One comment affected Alira more than the others. "You can hear her entire life in those notes." She quietly handed the phone back. For several moments, she did not know what to say. The employee smiled warmly. "You were incredible." Alira thanked him softly and continued working, but her mind remained overwhelmed all morning. People were noticing her everywhere now. At the grocery store later that afternoon, two women whispered excitedly after recognizing her from the video. A teenager near the bus stop asked for a photo with her. Even the cashier at the small corner market smiled and said, "I watched your performance 3 times last night." The sudden attention felt strange. For years, Alira had moved through life almost unnoticed. Now strangers looked at her differently, not because of her clothes or age, because of her music. That evening, She visited the community center like always. The moment she walked inside, the elderly janitor greeted her with the biggest smile she had ever seen on his face. "I told you," he said proudly. "I told you people would hear what I heard." Alira laughed softly through emotional eyes. "You were right." The old man pointed proudly toward the small television mounted near the reception desk. A local news station was replaying clips from her audition while discussing the growing online reaction. Even children attending evening classes nearby had gathered around the screen watching. One little girl looked at Alira curiously. "Are you famous now?" she asked innocently. Alira smiled gently. "I don't think so." The janitor chuckled. "You may not think so, but the internet disagrees." As she entered the piano room, Alira paused quietly near the old upright piano. It looked exactly the same as always. Worn keys, scratched wood, faded paint. Yet suddenly it felt more special than ever. This old piano had carried her through the hardest years of her life. She slowly sat down and touched the keys gently. For a moment, memories flooded back again. The loneliness after long workdays, the silent late-night practices, the tears she sometimes hid while playing. Nobody had seen those moments except this room. Now millions of strangers were hearing the result of all those hidden years. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The young contestant from the audition slowly stepped into the room. The same one who had mocked her most openly backstage. He looked uncomfortable standing there. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said carefully. Alira shook her head kindly. "No." He stepped farther inside while glancing around the small room in disbelief. "This is where you practiced?" "Yes." He stared at the old piano quietly. "I can't believe it." Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, he sighed deeply. "I've been thinking about yesterday all night," he admitted. "About how badly I judged you." Alira listened silently. He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I saw your clothes and your age and just assumed." He paused in embarrassment. "I assumed you weren't serious." A small sad smile appeared on Alira's face. "That happens more often than people realize." The young man looked genuinely ashamed now. "The truth is," he admitted quietly, "I've spent my whole life around competitions and music schools where everyone tries to look perfect all the time. Expensive clothes, confidence, reputation." He looked around the small room again. "But yesterday you played something none of us could." Alira looked at the piano keys thoughtfully. "Pain teaches people things success never can." The room became quiet again after those words. The young man slowly nodded. "I think yesterday changed the way I see people." Alira smiled gently. "Then maybe something good came from all this." Before leaving, he looked back toward her once more. "I really am sorry." "I know," she replied kindly. After he left, Alira remained sitting quietly at the piano for a long time. For the first time in years, she no longer felt ashamed of the difficult life she had lived. Those struggles had shaped her music. Without them, perhaps her performance would never have touched anyone so deeply. Later that week, the theater officially announced the performers selected for the city orchestra's special public concert. Alira's name appeared at the top of the list. The announcement created even more attention online. Reporters began requesting interviews. Local radio stations invited her to speak about her story. Articles appeared describing her as the hidden pianist who moved millions. The attention overwhelmed her. One afternoon, a television producer visited the community center to interview her beside the old piano she practiced on every night. Bright camera lights filled the small room while the crew prepared equipment around her. Alira looked nervous sitting before the cameras. The interviewer smiled warmly. "People everywhere connected deeply with your audition. Why do you think your performance affected so many viewers?" Alira thought quietly for several seconds before answering. "Because many people know what it feels like to give up something they love." The interviewer nodded thoughtfully. "You mean dreams?" "Yes." Alira looked down at the piano keys gently. "Life becomes difficult sometimes. People get busy surviving. Years pass very quickly." She smiled sadly. "Eventually many people stop believing their dreams still matter." The room remained silent while she spoke. But music stayed inside me even when I stopped performing, she continued softly. I think many people understand that feeling. Maybe not through music specifically, but through something they once loved deeply. Even members of the camera crew looked emotional listening to her. The interviewer carefully asked another question. What inspired the piece you performed at the audition? Alira's eyes softened immediately. My life, she answered honestly. She explained how different sections of the composition represented different periods of her journey. The softer melodies reflected grief and loneliness. Stronger movements represented survival and hope. I wrote parts of it over many years, she admitted. Sometimes after difficult nights when music was the only thing helping me keep going. The interviewer looked moved. That's probably why people feel such honesty in it. Alira gave a small quiet nod. After the interview aired, public admiration for her only grew stronger. Messages poured in from strangers around the country. Some people shared stories about abandoned dreams of their own. Others thanked her for inspiring them to return to forgotten passions after many years. One message touched Alira deeply. A woman wrote, I stopped painting 20 years ago after becoming a single mother. Tonight I bought my first set of brushes again because of you. Alira sat silently reading that message several times. She never expected her story to affect people this way. But perhaps the reason people connected with her was simple. She reminded them it was never too late to begin again. As concert night slowly approached, excitement across the city continued growing. Tickets sold faster than expected largely because audiences wanted to hear Alira perform once more. Yet despite all the attention surrounding her now, fear quietly returned inside her heart. The audition had been one performance, one unexpected moment, but the upcoming concert felt much bigger. Thousands of people would attend. What if she disappointed them? What if the audition had simply been luck? Those worries followed her constantly during rehearsals. One evening after practice, she sat alone backstage staring quietly at the empty concert hall seats. The head judge from the audition approached gently. You seem worried, he observed. Alira gave a nervous smile. I'm afraid people expect too much now. The judge sat beside her thoughtfully. Do you know why your audition affected everyone so deeply? She shook her head softly. Because you weren't trying to impress anyone, he explained. You were simply honest through your music. He smiled kindly. That's rare. Alira looked toward the empty stage lights ahead. What if I can't do it again? The judge shook his head gently. You already did the hardest part. She looked at him uncertainly. What was that? You allowed people to truly see you. Those words stayed in Alira's mind long after he left. Because for most of her life, she had hidden herself behind work, responsibility, grief, and silence. Now the world was finally listening. And deep down, despite the fear still living inside her heart, Alira slowly began believing that maybe her story was not ending after all. Maybe, after all those difficult years, it was finally beginning again. The night of the concert finally arrived faster than Alira expected. By sunset, the streets around the Grand Melrose Theater were already crowded with people waiting outside. Long lines stretched along the sidewalk while theater staff hurried between the entrance doors helping guests find their seats. Large posters displayed near the entrance carried Alira's photograph beside the words, Special City Orchestra Performance. For a moment, standing across the street beneath the glowing lights, Alira barely recognized the woman smiling from those posters. Just weeks earlier, she had walked into the same theater quietly, hoping nobody would notice her. Now hundreds of strangers had gathered hoping to hear her play again. The attention still felt unreal. She stood silently holding her old leather folder against her chest while people rushed around her excitedly. Expensive cars stopped near the entrance. Reporters spoke into cameras outside. Audience members discussed her viral audition while waiting in line. Yet despite everything changing around her, Alira herself still felt like the same ordinary woman who practiced late at night on an old piano after work. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. You ready? Her son stood beside her smiling warmly. Alira looked emotional seeing him there. As a child, he had fallen asleep countless times listening to her practice quietly at the community center. He alone understood how many lonely years stood behind tonight's performance. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. He laughed softly. "You said the same thing before the audition. And I was terrified then too." He gently squeezed her shoulder. "Maybe fear never completely disappears. Maybe you just learn to walk forward anyway." Alira smiled quietly after hearing those words. Together they entered the theater through a backstage entrance away from the growing crowd outside. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with nervous excitement. Musicians prepared instruments while stage workers moved quickly through hallways carrying equipment and music stands. Orchestra members warmed up nearby, filling the backstage rooms with scattered notes and conversations. Several performers smiled respectfully as Alira walked past. Many had watched her audition online before meeting her in person. One violinist stopped her gently near the dressing rooms. "I just wanted to tell you something," he said sincerely. "My mother watched your performance after recovering from surgery. It was the first time I'd seen her smile in weeks." Alira looked deeply touched. "Thank you for telling me." The violinist shook his head warmly. "No, thank you for playing the way you do." After he left, Alira stood quietly for a moment trying to process how much her music had affected strangers she would probably never meet again. Not long ago, she believed her life had become too ordinary to matter. Now people spoke about her music as if it carried healing inside it. Backstage assistants guided her toward a small dressing room prepared for performers. Inside waited a simple black concert dress hanging neatly beside a mirror. Alira stared at it silently. She had never owned anything like it before. Her son smiled while noticing her reaction. "You deserve this," he said gently. She looked uncertain. "I still feel like someone else should be here instead of me." He shook his head immediately. "No, this is exactly where you belong." After changing, Alira sat quietly before the dressing room mirror while distant audience voices echoed through the theater walls outside. Her hands trembled slightly again. Not because she feared failure, because the moment felt emotionally overwhelming. Years earlier, after losing her husband, she truly believed that part of her life had ended forever. Music had become only a private comfort hidden inside quiet nights and lonely practice rooms. Yet somehow, after all those difficult years, she was now preparing to perform before a sold-out theater. A small knock sounded at the door. The elderly janitor from the community center slowly stepped inside holding a bouquet of simple white flowers. Alira immediately stood in surprise. "You came." The old man smiled proudly. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Emotion filled her eyes as she accepted the flowers carefully. "You're the reason I even walked into that audition." The janitor shrugged lightly. "No," he corrected gently. "You walked in because the music inside you refused to stay hidden forever." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the old man looked around the dressing room quietly before smiling again. "You know," he said softly, "that old piano at the center feels very important now." Alira laughed through tears. "It always was important." A backstage assistant soon arrived to announce that the performance would begin shortly. The janitor squeezed her hand kindly before leaving. "Just play from your heart the same way you always did." After he disappeared into the hallway, Alira sat alone once more. She slowly opened her old leather folder and removed the faded photograph she carried everywhere. Her husband smiled back at her from the worn picture exactly as he had years ago. "You were right," she whispered softly. Then she carefully placed the photograph back inside the folder and stood up. The concert had begun. From backstage, Alira could hear the orchestra performing the opening pieces before her appearance. Applause echoed through the theater after each performance while audience excitement continued building. Finally, after what felt like endless waiting, the stage manager approached her. "You're next." Her heartbeat quickened instantly. The same fear from audition day returned briefly. But this time something felt different too. She was no longer walking onto the stage to prove herself. She was walking onto the stage to share something honest. As she approached the curtain, the orchestra conductor greeted her warmly. The audience has been waiting all night for you." Alira smiled nervously. "I hope I don't disappoint them." The conductor shook his head. "That won't happen." Then the announcer's voice echoed across the theater. "Please welcome Alira." The audience erupted into applause immediately. Alira took one slow breath and stepped through the curtain into the bright stage lights. The sight before her nearly stole her breath away. Every seat inside the massive theater was filled. Hundreds of faces turned toward her expectantly, while applause thundered through the room. Some audience members even stood before she reached the piano. Alira walked slowly across the stage, overwhelmed by the moment. She remembered entering the same building weeks earlier while strangers whispered cruel jokes about her appearance. Now those same walls echoed with admiration instead. When she finally reached the grand piano, the applause slowly faded into complete silence. Alira sat down carefully. For several seconds she simply stared at the keys. The theater became still. Then her fingers touched the piano. The first notes floated softly into the air. Immediately the room fell under the same emotional silence that had stunned audiences during her audition. But tonight felt even deeper, more confident, more personal. Alira played with complete honesty now. She no longer worried about being judged. Every note carried years of experience, sorrow, hope, and survival. The audience listened completely motionless. Some closed their eyes while listening. Others quietly wiped tears from their faces. The music moved through the theater like a conversation without words. Alira's hands no longer trembled. For the first time in many years, she felt fully at peace while playing. She remembered the lonely nights at the community center, the exhaustion after difficult work shifts, the moments she nearly gave up completely, and suddenly she realized something important. None of those years had been wasted. Even pain had shaped the music now filling the theater. Every hardship had added depth to the person sitting at that piano tonight. As the performance continued building emotionally, the audience seemed completely captured by the story hidden inside the music. The judges from the audition watched from the front rows with emotional expressions. The young contestant who once mocked her sat quietly nearby too. This time, admiration completely replaced arrogance on his face. Backstage staff stood frozen near the curtains listening silently. Even orchestra musicians waiting off stage seemed deeply affected. Alira reached the final movement of the piece. The melody rose powerfully through the theater before slowly softening again into gentle emotional notes. The room became so quiet that every breath could almost be heard. Then came the final note. It lingered softly before fading into silence. For one long moment nobody moved. Then the entire theater exploded into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet immediately. Some audience members cheered openly while others wiped tears from their eyes. The standing ovation continued louder and longer than before. Alira slowly stood from the piano bench, overwhelmed by emotion. As she looked across the audience, she no longer saw strangers. She saw people who had connected with her story, people who understood something deeply human inside her music. And for the first time in decades, Alira no longer felt invisible. The applause continued while tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of release, because after years of grief, sacrifice, loneliness, and silence, the world had finally heard her. Months later, Alira's life settled into something quieter again, but it never returned to what it once was. She continued performing smaller concerts while also teaching free piano lessons at the community center several evenings each week. Children, older adults, and complete beginners filled the little room around the old piano she once practiced on alone. Many students came not because they dreamed of fame, but because Alira made them believe it was never too late to reconnect with something they loved. Sometimes after lessons ended, she remained sitting quietly at the piano long after everyone left. The elderly janitor would still pass through the hallway smiling proudly while cleaning nearby. And occasionally, when the room became silent again, Alira would look around softly remembering the lonely woman who once practiced there believing nobody would ever hear her music. She had entered the audition feeling ordinary and forgotten. But in the end, the thing people remembered most was never her age, appearance, or struggles. It was the honesty inside her music. And long after the applause faded, that honesty continued changing lives in ways even Alira herself never fully realized.